This is Gene Geog History, and today I wanted to make a different type of video. It's about the label black. So, online and even in some real spaces, there's a lot of debate and argument about Black Americans being the only ones who were called black, who are called black, and who embrace that term because they see it as an ethnic term, though other people see it as a racial term, while some are intentionally grouping the two together like they're the same thing. And I wanted to do some research to see if this is true or not. So let's get right to it. Okay, so now we're going to go over why Black Americans were not the only people legally or socially called Black, as the term has been applied in various contexts to diverse populations, including people in other countries and under different legal systems. So, one of the reasons is that it's a very broad racial emphasis on racial classification. So, it is a racial classification term for people with a mid to dark brown complexion that has been used in many parts of the Western world, which includes Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, probably other places too. Obviously, different societies have their own criteria for what is considered black, and these social contracts have changed over time, though it usually involves sub Saharan Africa. So now we need to look at the term used beyond the United States. So it has been used to refer to people in other countries, particularly those with sub-Saharan African ancestry, though other places, very few of them, um, use it for people who are indigenous Australian or Melanesian ancestry, though it seems like it's specifically for those Melanesian areas and Australia. So, an example of this is in the United Kingdom. People with Caribbean or African heritage, though most people with Caribbean heritage have African heritage as well, it's just kind of a two for one there, are commonly referred to as Black, not African American. So, that's the term used in the United Kingdom and other places like United Kingdom in Europe. So we do need to talk about the social construction of the word. So the idea of a single black race is considered a social construct, not a scientific one, though it is based on the similarities in phenotype and ancestry. So the word is a social construct, but the similarities that are found within people that are considered in this race isn't socially constructed, if you kind of get where that's coming from. At the same time, different societies apply different criteria for who is considered and classified as black, and these social constructs have changed over time, though the basis of the similarities hasn't really changed much. Now, when it comes to the historical context, the specific legal and social implications of being designated black vary across different countries and historical periods. For instance, the Jim Crow laws in the US imposed a specific set of restrictions and social expectations on black people. Other countries had their own systems of classification and discrimination, such as apartheid in South Africa. Another thing about this is the evolving terminology. So, as we all know, language and identifiers evolve. For example, the term black is sometimes capitalized in the United States to reflect a shared identity and culture beyond skin color, especially when referring to descendants of enslaved people. And that is where the main distinction is. While specific terms like Kenyan or Nigerian are used when appropriate for people from Africa who live in the States, though on the census work, they'll just list Black and African American at once. So you have to take into account what the context of the term that is being used, who is it used for, and what it's being used for. Now I want to get into the early use of this specific term or the terms that we used for our Black people, specifically in the United States. So, generally, we have to look into the early use, i.e., the 17th century to the 1960s. So, before the 60s, African Americans were most commonly referred to by other terms. So, in the very beginning of the slave trade, they were called African within like the first few generations, but then they changed it to other terms. The first term that they mainly used was Negro, which they derived from the Spanish and Portuguese, which was their term for black. So the Anglophone English settlers got that from the Spanish and Portuguese during their slave trade. And then over the centuries, the term Negro was considered the most proper and polite English language term for people of black African origin from the 18th century, so the 1700s, until the 1960s. Though we're going to get into how that kind of changed well before the 1960s, though we did have people like Martin Luther King still using the term Negro. So the term colored became more commonplace and its use gained specifically in the 19th century, so the 1800s, and it was adopted by the newly emancipated slaves as a marker for pride. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, so the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, chose colored as the most positive term of its time. So now I'm going to talk about the more modern usage and the changes when it comes to the terms in America from the late 1960s onwards. So there's a major shift in terminology as the new generation of activists, i.e., the late silent generation and the baby boomers, embraced and reclaimed the term black as an empowering stance of identity and pride. Hence, terms like black is beautiful emerging in the mid 1960s to counter the negative connotations associated with blackness. And this movement was a conscious rejection of inherited terms like Negro, which many saw as rooted in slavery and segregation, and the term colored as well. Since the late 1960s, terms like black and African American have been most commonly used terms with some key distinctions. Black is a broader, more inclusive racial and cultural term encompassing people of the African diaspora beyond just those with ancestral ties to slavery in the US. Many prefer this term because it is a chosen identity, not one imposed by others. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes from, though I think a lot of the confusion with certain demographics and certain people is intentional, almost like willful ignorance. And then the second term is African American, which became more popular in the 1980s, promoted by leaders like Jesse Jackson to highlight a specific ethnic connection to the African continent. Though some people don't like the term African American because it's centering being from Africa, despite them not being from Africa in many, many, many generations. So, I wanted to find more information about the demographics that weren't Black Americans that were called Black. And what I got was very interesting. So, when it came to Africa, or at least most of the countries in Africa, a lot of people might not, or it says they may not primarily identify as black, but rather their ethnicity or nationality. The term black is often used to differentiate people of sub Saharan African descent from others. So I think that's where that economy is there. And I think with a lot of these countries in Africa, the overwhelming majority of the people are black. So having racial categories solely based on that would be seen as redundant, or I would assume it'd be redundant, which is why they would often go by their ethnicity, nationality, or their specific tribes. Though I think in some countries that might have changed due to colonization and all of that jazz. One of the countries that do stand out is South Africa, and this is mainly due to the whole apartheid situation, where the term black was politically used to refer to a coalition of non white South Africans and non colored South Africans who experienced oppression under the white minority government, and it mainly involved the African South Africans who were called that. Now I want to focus on the Americas, and this answer is pretty easy to me as the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization has led to significant black populations across the Western Hemisphere, where the racial terminology has developed distinctively, just like it has in the United States, but in the Anglophone, Francophone, and Hispanic community. So obviously there's going to be some similarities there. So in Brazil, it has the largest population of African descended people outside of Africa. Brazil has complex racial classifications, with the official censuses using categories like preto, meaning black, and pardo, meaning mixed/brown. Activists for the Black movement often group these together under the political term Negroes. Okay, that's kind of a one drop ruly thing, which is kind of problematic in itself. But we do know the term Negro came from the Spanish and Portuguese, so yeah. With Canada, Black Canadians are a multi ethnic group of African or Afro Caribbean descended people. Many trace their heritage to the immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa, as well as the Black loyalists and fugitive slaves who arrived from the US in earlier centuries. But I think with that latter group, there aren't as many of them, especially compared to the African Americans, and a lot of them most likely might procreated into the white population before the Afro Caribbean and African immigrants came over. So, with the Caribbean nations, in countries like Jamaica, an Anglophone country, and Haiti, a Francophone country, Black and Afro Caribbean are often used to describe the majority population who are descended from enslaved African people. And it's like that in most Caribbean countries, especially those that have majority Black populations. Now I'm going to move on to Europe, though it's kind of interesting because most European countries don't have much of a black population, so maybe they didn't feel the need to have a designated racial term for them, or an ethnic term or whatever. But anyways, black is used for populations of recent sub-Saharan, Afro-Caribbean, or Afro-European descent in most European countries, but we're only going to go through a few examples. So, obviously, the biggest example is the United Kingdom, where the term Black British is most commonly referred to people of African or Afro Caribbean ancestry, particularly those who immigrated from the Commonwealth. So, that's the interesting tie there. And the mention of the Commonwealth shows that the terms used in Britain were used in the Commonwealth countries and vice versa, especially when it comes to racial terms. For a time in the 1970s, black was also adopted by some Asian and other minority ethnic groups as a unifying political term. That's interesting. I never knew that, and I think that's something I should research into more. So, with France, statistics on race are not collected by the government. The term Black French people encompasses individuals of sub Saharan African, Afro Caribbean, and other mixed race descended people. It is interesting when you look into Asia and Oceania, with the main example for Asia being in the Philippines, where the Spanish derived the term negrito, which meant little black person, which was used by the Spanish colonizers to refer to the indigenous dark-skinned populations that they encountered in Philippines and other places in Southeast Asia. But I know the Spanish mainly colonized the Philippines in Southeast Asia. The term is still used today, and while it doesn't carry the same racial history as the Americas, its use has been questioned, and I do know that these people aren't the sub-Saharan African-descended black people. So, yeah. With Australia, the primary term Negro wasn't used for Indigenous Australians, though these people were sometimes grouped with Melanesians into the quote unquote Negroid racial classifications by those race theory scientists of the 1700s, 1800s Enlightenment era. Though, if you do study genealogy, ancestry, and all of that, you will know that indigenous Oceanians and Melanesians are the furthest away from sub Saharan African people, genealogy wise. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm kind of going to try to go through this relatively quickly. So, with the early colonial period from the 16th to 18th centuries, meaning from the 1500s to the 1700s, in the 1500s in Latin America, the Spanish and the Portuguese conquistadors began using the word Negro, i.e., black, in their languages as a general term for enslaved and free people of African descent. In the 1600s, the United States, though this also kind of just included the Anglo Caribbean places. The term Negro appears in American and British records, initially borrowed from the Spanish and Portuguese to use for their Anglo colonies. It's used broadly for people of African descent and doesn't become a formalized English term until later. In 1783, in Canada, the Birth of Negroes is created, documenting Black loyalists who fled the American Revolution. This shows the official usage of the term in British North America at this time, and you start to see it a lot in academia at around this time, especially because this was also kind of the time of the Enlightenment era and the race science era, essentially. So, in the late 1700s in Latin America, the term Negros also applied to indigenous people in Brazil, referred to as Negros de Terra, to designate them for servitude and slavitude, whatever. And that's interesting that they used it for indigenous people to kind of tie them closer to enslavement, which just shows the problematic element of this term, and it really was about that. This practice is later barred by a royal decree in 1755. I don't know why it would say late 1700s when 1755, when it ended, is in the mid 1700s. So, moving on to the 19th century, i.e., the post slavery era, where many of these colonies and countries would leave slavery throughout the 1800s. So in the 1860s United States, following the Civil War, the term colored is adopted by formerly enslaved people as a term of pride. However, Negro remains the most common and polite term in formal use, including within organizations. I'm wondering if a part of this was that the white people used the term Negro, where the black people tended to use colored more, and in more generalized areas that aren't formal. I didn't know this next part where in the 1880s Philippines, the Spanish colonizers used the term negrito, which is a little black person, to describe indigenous dark-skinned people they encounter in Southeast Asia. I think I've seen the term negrito used in a few other places in an Asian context, but they're not the same as black people. They're just darker-skinned Mongoloid people generally, or Australoid people. Late 1800s in Australia, European settlers used the term black to refer to indigenous Australians, and I just kind of mentioned the Mongoloid term, sorry, the Australoid term. And in Europe, they essentially used the term Negro for people of black African descent. So, on to the 20th century, i.e., the Civil Rights and the Black Power eras, the 1900s. So, in the early 1900s in the United States, Negro continues to be the most commonly used term, including for organizations like the United Negro College Fund, which was founded in 1944. That's the mid 1900s, not the early 1900s. Anyways, globally throughout the 1960s, the civil rights and black power movements led for a conscious rejection of the term Negro, as was called across the English-speaking worlds, where in the United States, black is embraced as a self-designator of pride and solidarity, popularized by activists and such. The shift happened rapidly, and Negro falls out of favor by the early 1970s, and it mentioned the English-speaking world, so the Anglo-Caribbean and other English places. Pretty much same thing in the United Kingdom. The term blacks adopted and used for ethnic groups, which included Asian people. That's kind of odd. Australia, pretty much the same thing, but it was used for indigenous Australian people, though the Australian census later began including black as a self-identification option. There's black with a C and black without the C. Those are the two distinctive differences there. 1980s in the United States, Jesse Jackson led a push for the term African American to be used instead of or alongside black, aiming to emphasize ethnic heritage of African Americans, or ADOS. And regarding the 21st century, so the 2000s essentially, when it comes to the modern usage, essentially Negro and colored aren't really used anywhere anymore. They're all considered outdated and offensive. In the United States, it's mainly both black and African American, though that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, as blacks used as a broader racial and cultural term, African Americans were specific. Canada is pretty much black. Latin America, the term Negros has complex usage, and present Australia, it seems like they use black without the C. So I wanted to focus specifically on the Caribbean timeline here, and then the next section will be the African timeline when it comes to the usage of the word. So essentially, the use of Negro and Black in the Caribbean depended and varied based off of who colonized what place or what island. So from the 16th to the 19th centuries, colonial imposition. So with the Spanish and French colonies, as early as the 16th century, which were the 1500s, the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers used Negro as a descriptive term for enslaved Africans. This usage was inherited by French colonizers who used the term negre with an E instead of an O. That's interesting. The term was synonymous with enslaved or servile status. So when you think of the creation of race and how they used black or negro, especially at this time, and how strongly it was attached to enslaved or the servile status. This is why. So, with the English colonies, the English colonizers in the Caribbean adopted Negro, influenced by Spanish and Portuguese usage, and used it to classify people of African descent. Like in the other colonies, it became a common term for enslaved people. So, the English, French, and Spanish used the term to describe African diasporic people and slaves, because this was during the time of the transatlantic slave trade. And then you see the sources there. In the 20th century, so nationalism and the rise of black. So technically the 20th and the 21st century. Post-emancipation. So after emancipation throughout most of the countries in the Caribbean, terms like Negro did persist, but as nationalist and anti-colonial movements grew, people sought to replace colonial imposed terms with their own self-chosen ones, which we will see throughout the next century and so. 1960s and 1970s, the Black Power movement. So the rise of the Black Power movement in the United States influenced similar movements across the Caribbean. The term black was embraced as a symbol of pride, power, and a rejection of colonial subjugation. In Jamaica, for example, census record shows that after 1970, more people identified as black rather than Negro or African. So in the present, or at least from the last 50 years, since the 1970s, in the English-speaking Caribbean, Black and Afro-Caribbean are the most common terms that are used in the Caribbean. In the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Negro is often more complicated. It can be a neutral descriptor for skin color, but can also be used as a term for endearment, even for people who aren't dark-skinned. That I never knew for the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Interesting. However, the term's meaning remains sensitive and context-dependent. Now I'm going to look into the African countries, or the continent, I should say, where the usage of the terms Negro and Black is definitely tied to colonialism and Pan-Africanism, but it's definitely different because these are places that has an overwhelming Black majority and have existed well before the transatlantic slave trade, with most people identifying by ethnicity or nationality. So from the 15th to 19th century, so this is essentially the 1400s to the 1800s with the European imposition. So when it comes to the Portuguese people who came in, I believe they were the first to enter Africa. As early as the mid-15th century, so the mid-1400s, Portuguese traders used the word Negro to refer to the Bantu people that they encountered along the coast of southern Africa. Colonial administration. European colonizers, including the English, used Negro and Negroid to categorize African peoples based on race, ignoring the numerous distinct ethnic groups, languages, and cultures that exist across the continent. Early European maps even labeled areas called Negroland. So this was by the time race was officially created, and they're doing all that race, science, and eugenics weirdness. So Africa was already being called by the Europeans stuff like Negroland. So slavery. In places like Ethiopia and Somalia, the term Negro or analogous local terms were used by the colonists to refer to the enslaved people. So it's yet again tying the term to slavery. So in the 20th century, Pan-Africanism and post-colonialism, we're going to discuss how things changed or maybe didn't change. The mid 20th century, as African countries gained independence from their colonizers, the term Negro, which was widely seen as a product of colonial oppression, was rejected. So essentially, this term was rejected worldwide, essentially. Pan African identity. So the Pan African movement encouraged a collective of African identity, but within their own national borders, where people overwhelmingly reverted to identifying by their nationality, example Nigerian and Kenyan, or ethnicity, i.e., Yoruba or Zulu. So there is no overwhelming African link up with a collective African identity due to all this, and then within the countries, there's infighting amongst the tribes and all that. It's very confusing and it's very multi-layered. In South Africa, of course, they have a different experience since they went through apartheid, where the classification of black was used politically to refer to many non-white groups of people by the white minority government, especially regarding the honoracial black people. So, in the present state, so the preference for ethnicity and nationality. So, obviously, this is where a lot of the conflict comes from when it comes to African Americans and non African Americans, but specifically Africans. When it comes to the modern usage in Africa today, the word Negro is virtually non existent in common discourse and is seen as an artifact of colonial oppression. The term black is also rarely used as the primary self identifier, with people preferring to be referred to by their nationality or their specific ethnic group. Because when you think about it, the nationalities in Africa were created by the colonizers, where a lot of them beforehand and up till today went by and go by their tribes. Now it is time to get into the conception or the belief that African Americans were the only ones who identified as black, or at least compared to African people, and get into why this belief exists. So essentially, all of this stems from a profound misunderstanding of how colonialism and nation building was shaped and how the identities were shaped outside of the United States. So in Africa and the Caribbean, though lesser in the Caribbean, national and ethnic affiliation often takes precedence over a broader racial classification like black, though the term has a complex history tied to resistance against the colonial powers. So, with Africa, the borders were arbitrary and weren't really chosen by them, as European colonizers drew the state borders in Africa with absolutely no regard for the existing ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries that already existed. And when the countries gained independence in the mid 20th century, their new national identities often had to be built upon and around and through these artificial borders that they didn't choose to create, unifying hundreds of diverse groups under a single flag, which caused its own issues, and many of these countries have civil wars due to all of this. So, with all of this, there is the prioritization of ethnic and national ties. So, within these post colonial nations, local ethnic identities like Yoruba in Nigeria, Igbo in Nigeria, Zulu in South Africa, etc., often hold more social and cultural importance than a pan racial identity. For Nigerian immigrants to the US, they do identify as Nigerian because them leaving their country and entering into a country that has different classifications as they do, the Nigerian title holds more than it would have in their country, and they want to hold onto the culture, so they identify as the Nigerian American. They also just feel stronger to, or a stronger connection to other Nigerians, regardless of their racial identity, than to African Americans, due to all the cultural and ethnogenesis reasons. So there still is Pan Africanism and post colonial pride, which encouraged solidarity across the continent of Africa, but this was often framed as a struggle or within a struggle against colonialism rather than a primary personal identity. So nationalism ended up playing a crucial role in building post colonial African states and countering colonial ideals of inferiority. Being Kenyan or Ghanaian became a source of independence and national pride. So, I want to get into the factors influencing national identity within the Caribbean. So, the first element is Caribbean being used as a geographic and cultural descriptor. The Caribbean consists of dozens of small island nations, each with its own unique Creole culture and history based on its specific colonial heritage. So, British, French, Spanish, Dutch. The term Caribbean often serves as a broader regional identity, but people tend to first and foremost identify with their home country, i.e., Jamaican, Haitian, and Bajan. And just saying Caribbean overall means nothing from a racial point of view, since there are several different races in the Caribbean. Some of them have predominantly different races compared to the other islands, and a lot of the islands have little to nothing to do with one another and never really have. Caribbean is just a geographic location that has no ties to any racial lines just based on that term. So now we're going to move on to the complex and fluid ethnic identities. The Caribbean identity is characterized by a high degree of ethnic mixing between African, European, indigenous, and in some cases, East Indian and Chinese populations, which makes it distinctive from the African Americans or even Africans. Unlike the United States one drop rule, racial identity in the Caribbean can be more fluid. So let's just say the Caribbean has places like in the Dominican Republic, where many of them identify as mulatto or Indio and not solely or as black at all. There is a shared colonial and post colonial experience. Despite their differences, Caribbean nations share a collective history of slavery, plantation economies, and European colonization. The shared experience creates a regional consciousness that is distinct from the African American experience, though there are some similarities in that element with African Americans as well. For many immigrants from the Caribbean, their experience of race is inseparable from their national or ethnic background. They may not have the same shared history of Jim Crow or segregation that shapes African American racial identity. And I think the distinction here is that in most Caribbean countries, so let's just say Jamaica, for example, an overwhelming majority of the population is black. So it's just like, it is what it is. We all generally look alike, where in the United States, African Americans have always been the minority. So I think that's kind of a differentiation tool there. Now I want to get into the final point of this video, or the final talking point at least, and that is the misunderstanding with African Americans. So this comes from a few elements or reasons. The salience of racial versus national identity is a misunderstanding. While African Americans in the United States have historically been unified by racial identity due to systemic racism, immigrants from African Caribbean may find their national and ethnic identities to be more personally salient. This can be misrepresented as a lack of racial consciousness. And I do think there's also the difference because the United States stupidly has a one drop rule, or had the one drop rule, and despite it being illegal or not a legal factor at all for 60 years, a lot of the after effects still remain, and a lot still have that belief where there is no one drop rule in anywhere in Africa or the Caribbean. There are a lot of misconceptions based on the United States or the American media. Many Americans, including African Americans, are unaware of the complexity of the African diaspora outside of the United States because media and education often focuses on the domestic Black American experience, and any media that is within the or that comes from the Caribbean or Africa is very isolated to those regions in those countries or in that area, where the American media is a lot more pushed worldwide in comparison. Another point is there are different experiences in racism. African immigrants in the United States often face racism while still identifying with their home country, can be confused by the American racial system, which tends to lump all people of African descent into a single black category, which isn't a thing in most African countries. The final element that goes into the misunderstanding with African Americans is the contested boundary of identity. So the boundaries of Black identity or that Black identity in the United States are often contested between the native born African Americans and the recent African and Caribbean immigrants. This is especially true for second generation immigrants who may feel pressure to conform to an African American identity while retaining their ethnic heritage, where African Americans don't have to worry about that because their family is where they've always been from, so they don't have to deal with that. So that concludes my video on the term Black and its usage within people in the diaspora within America compared to the Caribbean and Africa mainly, and to a lesser extent, other places in the world. This is definitely a very layered discussion. A lot of the points I made before making the video, while others I really didn't. And you really can see through everyone's perspectives on it. I also do think that a lot of this has to do with people either not getting the difference between nationality, ethnicity, and race, or just not caring about it and being intentionally ignorant with like lumping them together. So that's another element of this conversation that's just very annoying and very confusing. I am hoping to branch out from just talking about the Caribbean. Obviously, it is my base. My ethnicity is tied to the Caribbean, and I'm learning a lot more about the Caribbean. But I do kind of want to do more topics that tie the Caribbean to African Americans, Caribbeans to Afro European people, or Black people in Europe, and Caribbean people to Africans. So I'll do that a bit more. But yeah, thank you all for watching this video, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye!